garden. Come and have a look at this. You see that? That's bougainvillea. I have this interesting relationship with bougainvillea. Whenever I see bougainvillea, I have a this low sense, this low level sense of joy. I was thinking about that the other day, and I was wondering why that's such a persistent reality. And then I realized when my wife and I were first married, we'd been married about 12 months, at the most 2 years, when we decided to go on a little holiday together that was much more like a honeymoon than our first honeymoon. We actually did it as a bike ride, and by the end of the ride, we'd ridden over 3,000 kilometers. But we headed north, and we ended up in tropical Queensland. In tropical Queensland, bougainvillea is everywhere. Bougainvillea comes originally from South America, and it is a beautiful plant, isn't it? Wherever climates are warm, you tend to find bougainvillea. So I don't think many people would be unfamiliar with the site of bougainvillea. But there, in North Queensland, I took this photograph of my wife standing under a bougainvillea plant, and in that moment, my life felt more wonder-filled than I could ever have hoped or imagined. I have this beautiful woman who has decided to take this journey through life with me. I have a context in which I'm living that was giving me a sense of joy. But as I looked down the road towards the future, I think I was sensing that life would be good. And in that moment, it couldn't have been any better. Well, wouldn't it have been great if life had stayed as wonderful as it was there in that day with my wife standing under the bougainvillea? Of course, it doesn't, it isn't, it hasn't. And it's precisely because of that that a moment like that stands out as special and wonderful and exceptional. The truth is, the majority of life is somewhat mundane. And then we have these times, these periods in our life that seem to suck the very joy out of our existence. This walk in the garden that we are taking wants to respond. It's a desire to respond to some of those feelings as much as it is observations about love and worth. In these first three videos, I've tried to lay a foundation for this journey as we go. Our first video, I looked at the idea that love and worth are two sides of the same coin. The second video was reflecting on the idea that the meaning of life, the search for the meaning of life, is actually a search for worth, which in itself is a search for love. Today I want to reflect on that sense of despair. In fact, probably the best way to describe it is a sense of worthlessness. It's pretty windy today, so I've seated still in the backyard, but under a bit of cover to try and block out some of the wind noise. But you will hear in the background our chickens, or chooks as we call them here in Australia, talking to me. They are gathered at my feet. Can you see them there? That's because quite often when I sit here, I feed them, and so they're expecting some snacks. Nevertheless, let's continue, shall we? That sense of worthlessness that we have all struggled with from time to time is correlated with, if not the same as, the human experience of shame. I first encountered this idea of shame as more than just an emotion more than 30 years ago, and I've been thinking about it pretty constantly ever since, looking at its impact in my own life and trying to work out how there's a similarity between what I'm going through and what other people are going through. Responding to that experience of shame will be a pretty constant theme throughout these Walk in the Garden videos. And so that's why it's a foundational thought for us. Prior to the 1970s, shame was clearly known and understood. It was recognized as a major driver in most human cultures. But in the 1970s, a psychoanalyst called Heinz Kohut began to research it academically, and it moved into that mainstream area of study, to the extent which there's lots of information available about the experience of shame in our world today, and there are people that actually make a lot of money speaking to the issue of shame, writing books about the idea of shame, and it's a pretty well developed field of struggle of interest actually, to the point where sometimes the information about shame, or the overwhelming focus on shame, can miss the point. So part of what I want to do here is recognize the validity of that struggle, and understand the way that it works in our life. And just to join the dots for us, if love is a search for worth, and shame is connected with the experience of worthlessness, then the truth is, when we're struggling with shame, we're not receiving love. We're not engaged in self-love, and shame in itself becomes a barrier then to love. So it becomes an important part of this conversation. In my understanding, there are two features of shame that are most important to recognize, and they are this. Number one, shame is an identity concept. And secondly, shame is almost always relational. That is, while it's a deeply internalized experience, it is almost always connected with our relationships, our understanding of our relationships, and perhaps even our perception of what other people think of us. So those two issues, that it's an identity issue and that it's a relational issue, help us to recognize why it fits into this conversation about a walk in the garden. The very first couple, as they walked in their garden, it is said that they had no shame. So even in that ancient story, there is this recognition of how significant the struggle with shame is, and that ideally people are designed not to struggle with shame. So thinking about shame as an identity issue, what do I mean by that? Well, think about the words that go along with the experience of shame. So if we're experiencing shame, we usually have this sense of, I am worthless, I am a problem, I am dysfunctional, I am disabled, I am unable to do that which other people can do. It's always I am statements. The experience of shame feels a lot like the experience of guilt, except typically guilt has to do with what I have done, where shame has to do with who I am. As a relational concept, it has to do with, am I lovable or not? In fact, shame says I'm not lovable, I'm broken, and I'm unable to be loved. Because the search for worth is a search for love, the experience of shame that challenges our worth challenges the reality of whether or not we can be loved. And I've made this observation across the years. It is almost always true that where a relationship that formerly involved love breaks down, there is the experience of shame. In fact, sometimes people get so overwhelmed by shame that they believe they will never experience love again. Let me suggest that we can see shame at work in three different ways in our life, or three different areas of operation. We can see shame as an emotion. In that space, it's neither good nor bad. just is. It's our response to the contexts of life that we find ourselves in. Secondly, there is this psychological reality of shame, which is why it has entered into the arena of academic studies in the field of psychology. It is in that space where, given enough impetus, enough contexts, enough struggles, and if it goes unattended, a person can spiral down into what has well been defined as toxic shame. Shame that starts to impact the way we live, the way we function, and at the level that it becomes toxic, our need to find effective responses to it becomes increasingly important. But I observed a third area in which shame works that is much more, which is much deeper than that. It's foundational and yes, existential. It's our internalized description, if not prescription, of our reality. It's that idea that the moment that I'm in now, that I'm struggling with right now, is the worst experience I've ever had, or nobody else has life as bad as what I have it. It's those kinds of intense struggles. At our best, we rise above it as individuals, and we rise above it as humanity. There is this search for worth that impacts all of humanity and drives our best adventures. But at its worst, we descend as people into this space of ugliness. There's tremendous explanatory value in considering how important this search for worth and shame as an obstacle is in explaining the way we relate to each other. You can find it at work, in our employment situations. It's the battle over who will get recognition for a project well done, or perhaps the promotion. We can find it in our competitions. We can find it in our parochialism. But at a bigger level, we find it in the drive for colonialization. We find it in our revolutions. We find it in our wars. We find this search for worth, this desperate desire for worth in our need to make life comfortable or personally beneficial. And at that space, it drives our disconnectedness from the impact of the environment around us. Let me suggest that as the response to the struggles in our environment increases, what will ultimately cause us to react effectively to that struggle is when it begins to impact our very sense of worth and identity. And it's probably at the point that we begin to feel bad enough about ourselves because what we've done to the world in which we live, we will begin to find ways of responding to it. And that's a simplistic response. The truth is, people already are seeking to find effective ways to respond to our environmental struggles, and many people are doing a tremendous job. Let me suggest that for those people that are doing that work, there's a great sense of validation and worth as they begin to take steps in finding effective responses. So it's at play in everything we do. The good moves us forward. The good search for worth moves us forward. But this shame struggle shifts our perceptions away from the good to this internalized struggle with worth. There are so many ways that this intricate relationship between the search for meaning and our own personal struggle with worthlessness come together, that this journey in the garden, this walk in the garden, is going to be a long one. But with those three pieces firmly in mind, I think that it will be a good one. And we can walk together all the way back to the garden where there is no shame. Next time I'm going to have a a look at the protests that are happening around the world. And I want to try and have a shot at answering the question, why does it seem to be the young people that are at the front of the move for change, for the push for the greater good of humanity? And why is it the older folks and the systems that have been established that seem to be the greatest obstacle that has to be overcome? So if you want to see an old bloke having a go at finding the good in the drive of our young people, then join me next time. In fact, if you subscribe to the channel, it'll pop up when it's ready. But until then, keep walking in your own gut, and let's see where we get to. See you then.